April 30th, 1943. The waters off Huelva, on the southern coast of Spain, are calm beneath a pale morning sky. A fisherman named José Antonio Rey María hauls his nets and stops. Something is floating a short distance from his boat, rising and falling gently with the swell. It takes him a moment to understand what he's looking at. A body, dressed in a Mae West life jacket and the uniform of a Royal Marines officer, drifts face down in the water, tethered to nothing, belonging to no ship that anyone has reported lost. Attached to the corpse's wrist by a chain is a black official briefcase. Within hours, Spanish authorities will recover the body, and within days, that briefcase will pass through the hands of German intelligence officers in Madrid, who will photograph its contents with trembling excitement. They believe they have stumbled upon the most sensitive Allied invasion plans of the war. They have not. They have found exactly what British intelligence wanted them to find, planted with such precision that an entire branch of Hitler's military command will reposition itself in response to a man who never existed. This is the story of how a corpse, a fiction, and a handful of British officers in a windowless room in London helped make the invasion of Sicily possible, and how the dead were made to serve the living in one of the most audacious deceptions ever attempted. By the spring of 1943, the war in North Africa was drawing to its conclusion. German and Italian forces were being pushed back towards Tunis, and Allied planners in London and Washington had already turned their attention to the next stage of the campaign in the Mediterranean. The logic pointed unmistakably towards one target. Sicily sat like a stepping stone between North Africa and the Italian mainland, close enough to reach, large enough to serve as a base for further operations, and so obviously the next move that Winston Churchill is said to have remarked that anyone but a bloody fool would realize it was Sicily. That, precisely, was the problem. If the Allied objective was so obvious to British commanders, it was equally obvious to the German High Command, and an invasion force landing on a heavily reinforced coastline could expect losses on a scale that no one wanted to contemplate. Aerial reconnaissance already suggested the Axis powers were shifting men and armor towards likely landing beaches. Every additional division stationed in Sicily meant more graves for Allied soldiers waiting ashore. The challenge facing British intelligence was not simply how to hide the truth. Concealment was impossible. The target could not be disguised through silence alone, once the scale of Allied preparations in North Africa became evident to German reconnaissance. Instead, the task was to invent a more convincing story and deliver it into German hands so persuasively that they would act upon it as fact. This was not a new ambition. Deception planning had existed since early in the war, coordinated through a small unit known as the London Controlling Section, working alongside the 20 Committee, which oversaw the use of captured German agents turned into double agents feeding false information back to Berlin. But those channels had limitations. A double agent's reports could be doubted, tested, cross-referenced against other sources. What was needed for an operation of this magnitude was something with the appearance of accident rather than intention, something that would arrive in German hands not because anyone chose to send it, but because fate appeared to have delivered it. The Germans needed to believe they had been lucky, not deceived. Manufacturing that particular flavor of luck would require an extraordinary and, in the most literal sense, morbid solution. The plan itself had circulated in outline for some time before it acquired the machinery to make it work. Two officers, Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague of Naval Intelligence and Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of M15, were given responsibility for turning a clever but underdeveloped idea into an operational reality. Working from a cramped office in the Admiralty, they built, quite literally, a man from nothing. He needed a body, and finding one that could plausibly have drowned at sea without an autopsy exposing the deception was itself a delicate undertaking. Through discreet channels they obtained the remains of a Welsh vagrant named Glyndwr Michael, a man who had died after ingesting rat poison, whose death by phosphorus compound could, with a sympathetic pathologist's cooperation, be made to resemble death by drowning to anyone conducting a cursory examination. Michael, in life friendless and destitute, was given in death an entire invented biography of privilege and purpose. He became Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, attached to Combined Operations Headquarters. Montague and Cholmondeley built Major Martin's identity with the obsessive attention of novelists constructing a character who must survive the scrutiny of professional intelligence officers. He carried identity cards bearing a photograph of a look-alike officer, since the true face of the drowned man could not be photographed convincingly. He carried love letters from a fictional fiancée named Pam, composed with genuine tenderness by a secretary in the department. He carried an overdraft notice from his bank and an irritable letter from his father, small human frictions that no forger would think to invent because no forger would think they mattered. He carried theater ticket stubs, a bill from his London club, and a photograph of Pam on a beach, actually a photograph of a servicewoman working within the intelligence department. Every object was chosen because it suggested a life rather than announced one. The briefcase chained to his wrist, a detail meant to appear as standard security practice for an officer entrusted with sensitive correspondence, contained the operation's true purpose. A letter from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye to General Sir Harold Alexander, discussing invasion plans that pointed towards Sardinia and Greece as the genuine Allied objectives, with Sicily mentioned only as a deliberate feint to draw German attention away from the real targets. It was, in effect, the truth turned inside out, using the real code name for the Sicily invasion, Operation Husky, in a context designed to make the Germans believe Husky itself was the decoy. The body was transported by submarine, HMS Seraph, to the waters off the Spanish coast, a journey undertaken with a secrecy so absolute that most of the crew believed they were release a scientific weather buoy rather than a corpse. In the early hours of April 30th, 1943, the submarine's commander, Lieutenant Norman Jewell, released Major Martin into the sea roughly a mile and a half from the Spanish shore, close enough that the currents would carry him towards land, distant enough to avoid suspicion about the manner of his arrival. From that point onward, the operation depended entirely on the behavior of people who had no idea they were performing in a play. Spain, though officially neutral, maintained close and cooperative relationships with German intelligence services, and British planners were relying on precisely that relationship to ensure the documents reached Berlin rather than remaining locked in a Spanish naval office. What followed has become one of the most studied sequences in the history of wartime deception. The body was recovered, the local authorities were notified, and a Spanish naval officer took custody of Major Martin's personal effects, including the briefcase. British Vice Consul Francis Hazelden, working with local contacts, applied gentle and persistent pressure to recover the briefcase promptly, behavior calculated to suggest genuine anxiety about its contents rather than staged indifference. The documents did indeed pass through German hands in Madrid, where an intelligence officer carefully extracted, copied, and resealed the letters using techniques that left the paper appearing untouched. British forensic examiners, upon eventual return of the briefcase, discovered subtle signs that the letters had been unfolded and refolded, evidence that confirmed German eyes had seen the contents. The information traveled swiftly from Madrid to Berlin, where it reached senior figures including Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of the Abwehr, and, ultimately, the desk of Adolf Hitler himself. The deception achieved something close to total success. German intelligence assessments shifted markedly towards viewing Sardinia and Greece, rather than Sicily, as the likely Allied targets. Reinforcements, including armored units, were redirected towards Greece, and coastal defenses in Sardinia were strengthened, drawing resources and attention away from Sicily in the weeks before the actual invasion. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel briefly inspected defenses in Greece as part of the strengthened response. Precise casualty figures attributable to the deception cannot be calculated with certainty, since war is never so tidy as to isolate a single cause. but Allied commanders who reviewed intercepted German communications afterwards believed the operation had materially reduced resistance on Sicilian beaches and shortened the ferocity of the initial fighting. When the invasion of Sicily began on July 10, 1943, Allied forces encountered defenses that were real, but measurably thinner than they might otherwise have been, a difference that historians have generally credited, at least in part, to a dead man who never fought a single day of the war. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Germany was not without its own tradition of deception in intelligence work, though the comparison highlights just how far Operation Mincemeat's ambition exceeded typical practice on either side. German efforts tended to rely heavily on double agents and radio deception, feeding false troop movements and fabricated orders through channels the Allies had, in most cases, already turned to their own advantage without German knowledge. The Abwehr's own agents operating in Britain had, almost without exception, been captured and converted into unwitting tools of British deception through the double-cross system, meaning that German efforts to deceive were themselves being redirected against Berlin. American deception planning during the same period existed, but had not yet developed the same theatrical sophistication. American planners were, at this stage of the war, still building the doctrinal framework that would later produce operations of comparable scale ahead of the Normandy landings. What distinguished the British approach demonstrated at Huelva was the willingness to construct an entire human identity, complete with emotional texture and mundane imperfection, rather than relying solely on documents or signals traffic. A forged order can be doubted. A grieving father's letter about an overdraft tucked among a dead man's effects is far harder to disbelieve, because no one imagines that level of detail being manufactured for a lie. This granular commitment to plausibility, more than any single document, became the operation's genuine innovation, and it directly influenced the far larger deception campaign, Operation Bodyguard, that would protect the true landing site during the invasion of Normandy in 1944. The legacy of Operation Mincemeat extends well beyond its immediate tactical success in reducing German preparedness in Sicily. It became, in the decades that followed, something close to a founding text for the entire discipline of strategic deception, studied by intelligence services well beyond Britain as an example of how psychological manipulation of an enemy's assumptions could achieve results that no amount of additional weaponry or manpower could guarantee. The psychological dimension of the deception mattered as much as its material effects. German commanders were not simply misinformed. They were made to feel confident in their own correct judgment, reassured that their instincts about Allied intentions had been vindicated by a stroke of fortunate discovery. That confidence, precisely because it felt earned rather than imposed, proved far more resistant to later doubt than a piece of fabricated intelligence delivered through a suspect channel might have been. Ewan Montague later wrote publicly about aspects of the operation, and the broad outline became widely known after the war, though certain details, including the precise identity of the body used, remained obscured for decades, partly out of respect for the family of Glinder Michael, who died in obscurity and was, in a sense, given a strange and unwitting form of purpose in death that his life had never afforded him. His true identity was formally acknowledged and added to his gravestone in Huelva only later in the 20th century, a quiet correction to a deception that had otherwise been remarkably thorough. That grave can still be visited today in the Cementerio de Nuestra Señora, where Major William Martin, or rather the man who briefly wore his name, remains buried under a headstone that finally records both fictions and facts. Return for a moment to that morning off the coast of Huelva, to a fisherman pulling in his nets and finding something the sea should not have offered him. He could not have known that he was retrieving one of the most consequential objects of the entire war, nor that the man floating before him had never drawn breath as a Royal Marine, had never loved a woman named Pam, had never owed money to a London bank. He was looking at the assembled fragments of an invented life, stitched together in a windowless London office by men gambling, that grief and detail could accomplish what armies alone could not. What Operation Mincemeat achieved was not the invention of a lie so much as the construction of a life convincing enough to die for, and then to be believed in death more completely than most men are believed in life. Soldiers went ashore in Sicily in July 1943 into defenses that were real but weakened, into resistance that was fierce but not what it might have been, and some of them survived because a dead vagrant from Wales was made, briefly and posthumously, into a British officer carrying secrets that were never true. The war was not won by this deception alone. No single operation ever wins a war, but it was shortened by it, made survivable by it, in ways that can be traced in shifted German divisions and reinforced beaches left thinner than intended. Glyndwr Michael died penniless and unnoticed, and in dying became, without his knowledge or consent,